Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for sticking with us to the end of the day. Hopefully this panel will feel worth it. So yes, I'm going to be thinking about water abundance in California. And I want to start by acknowledging that the dominant narrative, if you think about water, it's often we think about, okay, water in California, it's scarce, or we live in an arid state. Or maybe you think about all of the different, you hear about all the sort of water wars happening of, oh, agriculture is using too much water, or cities are using too much water, or there's the salmon are using too much water. And what I want to start is kind of try to convince you that actually, for most Californians, we are in a state of relative abundance. So first, just in terms of like the physical hydrology, California is in reality less scarce than, or water in California is less scarce than it is variable. I can't not walk around, so please forgive me. All right, over here, we've got a map of the annual average precipitation over a 30-year period. And what we can see is that California, we do have some parts of the inland deserts, parts of the Central Valley, where it's as dry as anywhere in the country. We also have parts of the north coast of the Sierras that get as much precipitation as anywhere in the country. So we have really both extremes. Where California really stands out, though, is in how much we vary year to year. This plot on the right here is what's called the coefficient of variation. And that's basically how different each individual year's rainfall is from the average. And what you can see is that all of the dark colors are clustered around California. That means we have really wet years and we have really dry years. We have very, very few years that are kind of average, if you will. And because of these two realities, mix of really wet and really dry places, and also this change year to year, we have built out this vast water infrastructure where we built all of these dams, all of these canals to move water from the wet places to the places where people live or the places where we're growing big crops. We also store water, capture it and store it in the wet years for later use in the dry years. And this infrastructure, I will admit, there are some very big environmental challenges with this. It's disrupted a lot of our water cycle, in particular for groundwater recharge, if we're thinking about sort of water supply. But it also means that for most Californians, water is already abundant. So 95% of the population and 90% of our economy are supported by just 20% of human water use. So that's not of all water in California. It's just of the water that we actually pull out of the environment for human use. In terms of the economy, we've had this historic shift from early on mining, then to agriculture, then to manufacturing, and more recently to services. And with each of those steps, we've turned into a less and less water-dependent economy. So today, most of our GDP doesn't actually need that much water to succeed. And so what that means is that for all of these urban and suburban Californians, water is already abundant. We are there. What about that missing 5%? There are three main reasons why we have that 5% of people who don't have enough water. The first is major overdrafting in groundwater-dependent areas, which is leaving wells running dry. So the places we use a lot of groundwater are the Central Valley and parts of the Central and South coasts. And you probably hear, anytime we have a drought, there's stories about, oh, all of these houses are losing, their wells are running dry. The problem is, that is a problem. We're also managing such that that will become more and more of a reality in the future. This is a map from a study looking at the sort of target minimum thresholds under our new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So this is basically the minimum water level that these plans are managing for, and zoomed in on just the Central Valley. On the left here, these are all places where that minimum threshold is leaving most of their public water supply wells with plenty of water. But we see actually there's quite a few places in both Sacramento and San Joaquin Valleys where we have upward of 75% of our public water supply wells are going to be fully dewatered under the thresholds that we're actually managing for. That's a big problem. The second major cause of lack of abundance is not having clean water. Where these are places where the water that comes out of your tap doesn't meet federal safe drinking water standards. And we can see there are almost 1 million Californians for whom this is true. They are primarily in the Central Valley, as well as other inland areas, Imperial Valley, as well as a few concentrated parts of some of our urban areas. And finally, affordability. We have really variable amount of how much people have to pay for their domestic water supply across the state. This plot up here shows that about half of Californians pay somewhere on the order of $40 to $80 per month for their water. This is 2019 dollars. But we do have these spattering spots where people are paying over $120 a month just for their sort of basic drinking water. And when you are a low-income household, that can definitely be a burden. Since these numbers came out, we also know that public water utility rates and water supply rates have been increasing faster than inflation. So I don't know exactly what the numbers are today, but they're much higher than this. So what does abundance then look like for California? I will define water abundance as every Californian having enough clean, affordable water for drinking, bathing, and cooking. So sort of your basic water needs. And anybody who's familiar with water in California might be saying, hey, that looks like our human right to water law, AB 685. This is already legislation and has been for over a decade. But as I just pointed out, there's a lot of people for whom this is still not true. We still have, by this law's definition, almost 2 million Californians who are supplied by water utilities that are not meeting these basic needs. So what then do we do about it? I think some of the lower hanging levers, perhaps, for building further water abundance in California. First, looking at groundwater would be to enforce shallower minimum thresholds under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We could have, instead of having each individual local groundwater sustainability agency decide what thresholds they want, the state could step in and say, actually, you have to have a minimum threshold that is shallow enough that every domestic and public water supply well in your area is protected. We can provide funding and technical support for small water system consolidation. This would both help with some of the contamination problems because generally our smaller systems are really the ones that struggle to meet Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, and would also provide some economies of scale, helping to meet with some of those affordability challenges. California has done a lot of small water system consolidation. However, most of it has happened so far in pretty affluent areas and very little in more rural parts of the state. Another affordability tweak is working with water rate designs, where right now we have your water bill is going to look like a mix of your fixed rates, so that's kind of just the base fee you pay every month to your utility, and then variable costs depending on how much water you actually use. And the fixed rates are where our water affordability challenges can come in, because those utilities like to set them as high as possible. That's guaranteed income, but that can be really, really challenging to pay. So thinking about varying ways of perhaps progressive designs for that fixed part of the cost. And then finally, actually opening up new sources of water supply through easing permitting requirements for brackish desalination, so that's for your slightly salty groundwater, for having aquifer recharge, capture all of those flood flows that are coming out of the mountains in really wet years and putting it back underground for storage, and expanding water recycling. All right, with that, I will pass it over to Keith. Oh, never mind. With that, we will pass it over to Anastasia for her video.
Food and Environmental Sciences. And I really want to be with you in person, but I'm here on the East Coast due to a family medical emergency. And so thank you very much for allowing me to share this with you virtually. I've been asked to talk about the role of food in California's abundance agenda. And I wanted to sort of start with just the reminder that food is much more than sustenance in our state. It's really about our culture. And I've illustrated that a bit with the California roll, and California sourdough, and of course, California fish tacos. We as a state are a major producer of food. We produce 80% of the world's almonds. We produce the majority of milk in the United States. And we use that for all sorts of dairy products, including, of course, cheese. In terms of the abundance agenda, we are a progressive state. We have a human right to food recognized by the legislature, but we also have challenges. We have a large population, and at least 20% of that population at various times is food insecure. And particularly groups such as elderly and disabled are disproportionately impacted by food insecurity. We know that people with food insecurity face higher than average health burdens, and that the social systems that we have in place, including a variety of benefit programs, are often undersubscribed. And so in comparison to national levels, where about 74% of the population, the U.S. population, is participating, we only have about 59% of eligible individuals able to benefit from the programs that we have. We, of course, have a lot of challenges with what average California residents are consuming. Many of the products are ultra-processed and low nutrition. That, of course, has its own health burden, particularly for metabolic-related syndromes. We have challenges around our production systems, particularly the ecological integrity of our soils. We know that in 2023, only about 5% of our farmers were using new soil health practices. And of course, sort of looming over everything is climate impacts ranging from droughts to sea level impacts on major food production areas such as the Delta. So in terms of this summit, we have a number of different approaches to think about what an abundance agenda might look like. And so I've suggested here 4 different possibilities that I will go into in further detail in a moment. But I wanted to emphasize that part of that is having high quality food available for everyone, in addition to having healthy food options that are providing those vitamins, minerals, and micronutrients that every Californian needs. And we also need to be thinking about the ecological biodiversity of our soil to make sure that we are able to continue to have production at the levels that we've been having in our state. And then perhaps most important of all is food as a community builder. And with that last point of food as a community builder, I wanted to share a case study with you folks in just a moment. But before doing that, highlight a number of different efforts that are already underway in our state, ranging from the recognition of the human right to food, plus looking at our supply chain from the farm to communities. So those are two excellent legislative efforts that are underway, plus money that is going to healthy soil programs. As I mentioned, food as a community builder is really significant, and we can draw on some case studies from other countries, and in this case, Japan, with their program called the Kodomo Shokudo, which is an effort that started in 2012 in Tokyo to try to provide better quality and quantity of food to a variety of vulnerable populations across the city. And so these were efforts that started with volunteer retired professional chefs, and the meals were subsidized or in some cases free. And as we look at the program today, a little over 10 years later, there are now more than 10,000 locations in Japan, and they create these kind of shared eating spaces that are judgment-free. They're run by a variety of different social actors, sometimes individuals, sometimes nonprofits, and they receive financial support, typically from local governments. And these have been considered quite a success, both on the level of delivering quality food, but also in terms of creating multi-generational hubs within a community. And you'll see in that last point, the Japanese have really seen these programs as being essential for creating civic community. So going back to the 4 points that I shared earlier, what would it look like possibly if we're thinking about innovations beyond what we already currently have in our legislation? What would it look like to have innovations on providing high quality food for every life stage? Well, we could look at these Kodomo Shokudos, these kind of community kitchens. They're called children's kitchens or children dining rooms in Japan, but community kitchens. We could look at taxes as a possibility. Taxes on highly processed food that doesn't have sufficient nutrition for the public and is creating public health burdens. We can look at making sure that all low-income Californians, regardless of their immigration status, have access to food, high-quality food. Thinking about access to healthy food options more broadly than for more vulnerable communities, we might want to start to play around with some new models. We have utilities for electricity production. We have utilities for water. What about utilities for basic food products, for having access to a healthy basket of fruits and vegetables, some eggs, some dairy, and other kinds of products that we produce here in California, and that in many cases we export to other states. What about providing this food in a food utility model to our residents? What about thinking about creating affordable meals at work sites of a certain size? In places such as Germany, there are often dining halls that are part of a variety of different kinds of institutions that provide at least one affordable meal, usually around €5, $6 or $7, but nutritional meal, a nutritionally balanced meal to workers that they will be able to avail themselves of. What about having cold storage spaces? If we think about food deserts, subsidized cold storage spaces for businesses that deliver food produce to existing food deserts across our state. Other possibilities that might form part of an abundance agenda in terms of policy interventions might be thinking about additional financial incentives to provide for optimal soil practices. We only have about 5% of our farmers participating. Perhaps there could be other incentives that could be structured. Maybe we think about new technologies. We could think about some of the roles of greenhouses. There is work underway in other drought-prone areas of the world to implement infrastructure in the form of seawater greenhouses that allow for seawater to be used as in the production of a variety of different crops. And then finally, and once again, perhaps very important right now in the current political climate, is thinking about food as a community builder and bringing people together into neighborhoods to have kind of civic conversations over food that could be subsidized or could be free, depending on the particular community, that provide these kind of spaces, these really significant spaces. We might also want to be thinking about our next generation of food producers. Many individuals who would like to get into food production are young. They don't have a lot of capital, and they need income. And it's, as anyone who's ever been in farming knows, it's very hard to profit in the farming business. It's a very risky business. And so perhaps the state could look at subsidized basic income that would be particularly targeted for smaller agricultural producers. And this would be as part of a community service to provide food back into that community. Fresh fruits and fresh vegetables, milk, dairy products, and other things that California is already producing. And then a final thought is to think about whether it might be time to start capping the profits of food and beverage companies that go to shareholders in order to produce the financialization of our food systems. And what would this look like? This would look like taking whatever profits there might be and really reinvesting them into sort of healthy food production, reinvesting them into proper worker compensation, and thinking possibly about a variety of philanthropy, perhaps, for example, supporting the Kodomo Shokudos, the community kitchens. These are just a few ideas. I am thankful for the time to share these ideas, and I very much welcome ongoing conversations with all of you. And thank you again for letting me share this with you.
Will this load up? Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Keith Taylor, Professor of Cooperative Extension, Community Economic Development from UC Davis. I like to say, what does cooperative extension means? It means that my classroom is in the community, not on campus. So today, there we go, I'm talking about the energy transition and how it reveals a world not just of energy abundance, but also economic abundance through appropriate institutional application, connecting to the content you've heard today. So let me take you on a journey. So we know California is a leader in the energy transition. We quite literally produce a glut of solar power at the wrong time of day, pictured here in the infamous duck curve. But new technologies and new entrants in the California power market are helping us properly harness our renewable energy abundance, leveling the duck curve through distributed energy resources, virtual power plants, batteries, and other technologies. We can see a clean, renewable, more equitable electric grid on the horizon. These new entrants in the energy marketplace, plus new state and federal level policies, provide a rich opportunity for community wealth building by leveraging the grid as a common pool resource to be used in energy entrepreneurship. And yet California is missing the opportunity for energy equity and abundance. So what gives? Well, the way we do economic development in the United States creates a scarcity trap by privileging investor-owned firms, putting all other forms of business enterprise at a competitive disadvantage, including America's much revered small businesses. That means that our state and federal policies tend to fixate on legacy investor-owned utilities whose hefty margins are protected and guaranteed under various state public utilities commissions. Their shareholder profits and bankruptcies are on our backs as energy consumers. We see severe grid mismanagement, poor stewardship of ratepayer dollars, and disadvantaging executives and their shareholders along the way. Electricity bills go up, energy poverty increases, and the economy is harmed. You know, if you've ever heard these stories of folks that are trying to build new housing developments, one of the things they're running into is plugging into the existing grid because the investor-owned utilities not playing nice with the developers. So what if I told you that there are options beyond waiting on just the government and just big business, right? And what if I told you that California, the land of entrepreneurship, is overlooking public entrepreneurial innovations in the South and the Midwest, providing possibility pathways to abundance, right? I like to say in the work that I do, I'm bringing Midwest innovations to California. Yeah, that's right. Illinois, where are you? Okay. You know, Missouri's cool. What if I told you that institutional diversification is essential for offsetting the excesses of the market and the state? So I love this image here. This is a real image of farmers standing up their electric utility. Investor-owned utilities in the early 1930s refused to electrify rural America. If you weren't aware, in the 1930s, about 90% of the American countryside was not electrified. And it was mostly the rural region. We're seeing that played out in broadband. I talk with Eddie about this quite often. The administration of FDR created the Rural Electrification Administration to back the public power movement. They did this not with taxpayer handouts, but low-interest loans paid back to the taxpayers. The result, in my opinion, is one of the most successful public policies in American history. Created the public power movement across the United States. It's a hidden economy of community-owned power. The financing and technical assistance from the feds drove the USA to 100% electrification in a 20-year window. There's today, the legacy of this, there's over 800 locally owned electric cooperatives around the United States. These are tiny utilities that get economies of scale and scope through federation after federation. They're owned and governed by over 42 million Americans. So a lot of folks say these rural folks can't take care of themselves, can't self-govern, can't do entrepreneurship, but they're doing it. They employ over 70,000 people in some of the best paying jobs in these rural regions. Also, these jobs have pensions. So they're still kind of doing all these great legacy workforce incentives. And there's this robust entrepreneurial ecosystem that's allowing these small utilities to outperform larger utilities through a federated system of co-ops of co-ops. Here, this is an economic impact of the sector that kind of illustrates all the electric cooperatives, all their jurisdictions around the United States. These tiny electric utilities are labs of economic democracy. They're some of the world's leaders in deploying solar, wind, batteries, microgrids, and including broadband and water systems. It sure would be nice if California could start from scratch and start with these utilities, right? And instead of kind of leaning into the massive investor in utilities that we have right now. But actually, we do have some capacity in the system. I don't know how many of you have heard of the California CCAs, the Community Choice Aggregators. California has a system of 25 community choice aggregators or paper utilities that negotiate price and power portfolio with incumbent utilities on behalf of the 14 million ratepayers that they represent. These CCAs could serve as entrepreneurial ecosystems for new energy entrepreneurship in California. To supercharge this, the CCAs could connect with the National Electric Cooperative System. This way they can get overnight economies of scale and scope. But that's not all, though. As we start exploring this system, we discovered that there's more than just these cooperatives and CCAs. There's this whole network of other hybrid institutions in all of these other sectors across the United States. And they work outside of just the government and just the market. And if we start engaging with these particular institutions, it can help to contribute to a broader abundance agenda. So the United States, the land of laissez-faire capitalism, is also the land of cooperatives. If you hear, Spain and Italy and across Europe, there's these amazing, robust co-op economies, but the United States is the biggest co-op economy in the world. What's more, though, you mentioned this, and a lot of folks tend to be pretty dismissive about it. Oh, where are they at? I don't see them in my day-to-day life. But there are actually a ton of recognizable brands that you live with every day. Sunkist, I like my Diet Sunkist soda. Pachamama, if you're here in Sacramento visiting, go to Pachamama Coffee. It's one of the only coffee chains that's actually owned by the farmers directly. If you do fair trade coffee, 50 cents per cup goes back to the farmer. Pachamama sends about $2 per cup back to the farmer. So it's huge. So we often take for granted that we interact with many of these co-ops on a daily basis, and these co-ops cover a ton of industrial domains that many of my colleagues are passionate about. So ag and food, water, housing, healthcare, and so much more. In my work, I'm convinced that to recognize an abundance agenda, we must go beyond just the market and just the state, which is to say just investor-owned firms and just the government, and into this hidden economy of co-ops and other types of hybrid enterprise. So I want to put this up here. This is just to demonstrate what's in the hidden economy, the scope and scale of it, the kinds of institutions that are out there, and the scale of the sector. It's enormous, but we don't have public policies out there to match and harness this. Instead, our economic development policies are all about how do we attract investment capital? How do we appease the private equity groups and the hedge funds? Instead, we could be seeding these groups. So I'll close by saying this. By exploring the energy transition, we get exposed to a world of hybrid institutions. We need not start from scratch. Many of these institutions already exist. They're waiting for us to wake up and engage with the management and run for the boards. Just throw one example. We have Golden One Arena. That is a credit union. What is the credit union doing in our local community, right? So my efforts will continue to reveal the institutions in this hidden economy and help everyday people and policymakers engage with this massive sector. But more than anything, it's my intent, this awareness gives us hope that we all have this actionable resource in these institutions. We need to drive a real, equitable, abundance-based economic system now. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Anastasia, for your virtual presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean. So we're going to launch into a few questions here. Is everyone still awake? And you're still here? That's cool. The first question, and this is more of a sort of listening test for our presenters here, but wondering what specific connections you see across your respective policy areas, if we're thinking about the food, energy, water nexus, and looking at that through an abundance frame. What do you see from each, like from what we heard today? So, Nicola?
Yeah, so looking from the water sector perspective, I mean, this is a place where there is the food, energy, water nexus. Like, people recognize there are big interconnections there. And I think that part of this is thinking about if we can build abundance in one area, to what extent are we either harming another area, or are we supporting that area? So just to give some examples, our water system in California is about 20% of the total electricity demand and 30% of the total natural gas demand for the state of California. So just moving around the water in the state uses a lot of electricity. The natural gas is coming from heating in domestic and commercial uses, heating water. And so any move in the energy space that is moving to either more affordable energy or lower greenhouse gas emission energy, all of that is going to also help the sort of overall efficiency of the water sector. Similarly, we have hydropower as one of these big sort of buffers for dealing with that duck curve, where you can store energy behind a dam to release whenever you want. But that depends on having a lot of water. And if you're in one of those dry water years, there's a lot less hydropower contributing to the electric grid. Food is one that is a little bit more challenging, I will say, in terms of abundance opportunities, where really any decision that is going to pull water away from the agricultural sector is potentially going to harm. So agriculture is the largest water user, 80% of our human water use in the state. And we've also been shifting to things that need more rigid water supply year by year, in particular perennial crops, so your trees, for instance. But as Anastasia pointed out, there are opportunities where if you are, first shifting to like the seawater hydroponic growing, that would use basically no water of our fresh water supply in the state. So that would be a real big win-win, I think, for both sectors. Also, some of the soil management practices are also going to help your overall crops be more robust and more resilient, and therefore potentially using less water there as well.
So what I would add, in the kind of work that I do, I start from the orientation of community economic development, how we can set up systems so that they are not only self-sustaining, but also in control and to the advantage of the communities they represent. So I go into these various domains to learn more about each one of the domains. I'm kind of a generalist in that way, and then try to figure out how it is they can link and leverage the resources so in this world of scarcity that they can actually have this abundance approach. So I think about your work, that you do, we were talking about this earlier. Newsom has put a lot of resources into the local water systems around the state, and I can't help but think, what if there were some connections to the electric cooperatives and their ability to do purchasing for infrastructure, right? Turns out the electric cooperatives have 9 co-ops of co-ops that deal with supply. If you go down to South Carolina, the 20 electric co-ops come together and they form this supply co-op called See Us. And when a hurricane goes through South Carolina, the electric co-ops shut everything down. They move all their bucket trucks and everything to the warehouse. It's pretty secure against a hurricane. And once a hurricane passes over, they deploy all the supply out in order to get the grid back up. Duke Energy tends to be down for about 3 weeks after a hurricane. The electric co-ops tend to be down 3 days, right? They have this really just amazing resilience in their system. And I can't help but think, what if these electric cooperatives were better connected to our utilities in California? You know, they're definitely thinking about resilience, uptime, and that sort of thing. But one of the challenges I see, and again, we were chatting about this too, California has a tendency to have its back to the rest of the country. It's say, we're the innovators and we're the entrepreneurs. It's like, well, you are to some extent, sure, but the Midwest and South are doing some pretty cool things. They've had to deal with some pretty rough terrains for years. So we could also learn in that way too. So I think not only across our domains, but also across geographies, we can pick up a lot of great skills, tactics, and strategies for a greater abundance agenda.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I guess to build on that point, and this is something we've heard a lot about already, and in the spirit of abundance as really bringing forward more creativity, what examples have you seen in your respective fields? And I know we've had some examples already, but examples of innovation and creativity, either technology, governance, but also to Kate's point earlier about storytelling, of how combined these different things can help support, build the political will, I guess, to support an abundance agenda.
You want me? So some of the creativity I've seen, so it's easy in California to use the big legacy utilities as a punching bag, and I like to do that myself. So PG&E will say there's a lot that they can't do. We have to pay for our bankruptcy, we have to pay for our mishaps and all this sort of thing, but yet they're guaranteed by the Public Utility Commission to have about a 12% profit, right? So they said even with that 12% profit, they can't do all this energy hardening, they can't move the lines underground, whatnot. But if you go down south, outside of Palm Springs, there's this little electric cooperative called Anza Electric Co-op. They have a margin that goes anywhere from 1% to 7%. When the general manager took over in the late 2000s, they had wood infrastructure instead of steel for the grid, right? They just had severe underinvestment. So he set himself on a strategy of hardening the grid, so swapping out all the wood poles with steel. They've done that. Then they said, okay, now we're going to make it where one line that comes in from Southern California Edison, we're going to back that up. How do we do that? Do we connect to Arizona and double our asset base? No, that's expensive. What if instead we did a microgrid, which PG&E says they can't do? They absolutely set up a microgrid in Anza. So now whenever the power goes out, the downtown is lit up for 8 hours. Their goal is to make it where they can have 24-hour uptime for their whole service territory. Along the way, they then recognized in order to have this distributed energy resource that they needed to have fiber optic to communicate between the utility and the ratepayer. Said, well, this is going to cost a lot of money. What if we lit this up and provided fiber to the home, broadband? So tiny little Anza Electric Co-op also provides fiber optic to the home. I like to say that they have South Korea-style internet in Southern California at this little rural electric co-op. That's just one example. There's over 200 of these electric co-ops that have gone into broadband. A couple of them have also gone into other utilities areas. One of my favorites to talk about is out of Indiana, one called 9Star. Not only have they done broadband, but they've also gone to water systems as well. So they're demonstrating that they can actually do rural water too. This is all, and if only California would engage in these conversations, we could really do a lot for our electric grid, for a lot of our other utility systems. So that's what I would add.
Excellent. So the water system is, I will say it's a little harder to come up with some of these stories. Part of this is the water industry is famously risk averse. And everybody wants innovations, but no water utility wants to be the one to try it out for the first time. And so everyone is kind of looking to everyone else to say, hey, that sounds like a great idea, but you want to try it out? And we're not doing it first. There are, however, a few exceptions. So I live in Irvine, and Irvine Ranch Water District is one of the more innovative, I will say, for the water sector, one of the more innovative water utilities in the state. They have done a lot of really cool work thinking about stormwater capture, water recharge, really trying to kind of build a water supply system that works with the space that they are in. They also do a lot of different sort of community education programs and things like that. And I mean, to be completely honest, like, I don't know why they are innovative. Maybe they have a lot of money, which definitely helps with that. There also, though, I think that a challenge is this scarcity mindset that exists in the water sector, where, because everybody is afraid of losing their water rights or losing what they have, you immediately start to get into a defensive mode, as opposed to opening up this abundance mindset would then let us be, hey, let's actually play with some more creative options. Let's think about what would happen if we actually coordinated and worked together and got some bigger picture thinking that would help open up some things. And so there are places around the world that have gotten to, I think, these more interesting, innovative systems. Singapore, for instance, comes to mind. They're a little island that has no fresh, or not no, but almost no local fresh water supply, and they have really, really pushed forward recycled water as their main water supply because they have kind of no other choice, and have really put a lot of innovation and investment into that. Sorry if that's not the rosy picture that we would like to see, but there's at least a little bit of hope.
That's great. That's why we're all here. Thank you. My next question is something that's loomed large over all of this question of governance, and a lot of the examples I'm hearing are local in nature. You brought up CCAs earlier, and we're talking about from the food perspective and water as well. But what then do you see as the role of the state in supporting that local innovation to allow some of these innovations to thrive?
So the state is a huge, in California, we've got a huge provider of the sort of funding and support in order for innovation to happen. I generally am actually kind of critical. I think that the state could play a much bigger role in forcing innovation at the local level. For instance, I mentioned in my presentation the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So first time we're coming together, let's actually try to regulate groundwater. And the state went all in on local control and said, okay, each local groundwater agency is going to, first of all, decide on the borders of their groundwater agency, as opposed to having them match actual natural hydrological boundaries. They're going to decide what sustainable targets they want to meet, and then they're going to write a plan about how they're going to meet those. And with that, then it means we have this huge variation, and a lot of places that kind of need the most help are writing these plans that have a bunch of wells running dry. And so I think that the state could actually do more to step in and say, hey, we want to help you at the local level to build this capacity to actually do better. Let's think about what would happen if we actually, instead of each individual irrigation district doing their own thing, if we scaled up to this whole basin, we would have a lot more flexibility. We would have a lot more opportunities to think about sort of building capacity. We would have a lot more opportunities for sharing this sort of costs that we're facing. And so I think that in the water sector, there's a lot more space. They are doing a lot of capacity building and a lot of funding in particular, but the state could help with that innovation as well.
So what I would add to that, you heard in the presentation I gave, I was talking about going beyond markets and state. So it's not to say there isn't a role for the state, but I think that we have to get very creative beyond the state. And the reason why is we just can't trust the state's always going to be there for us. And we kind of see that right now. I take this with me because I'm from the rural Midwest. I saw the hollowing out from the government of how they were treating these rural communities. And what they would do is they would incentivize large investor-owned firms to come to our communities, drive down labor protections. They'd treat us as sacrifice zones and exploit labor. And I didn't see the government come in to help any of these folks. So that's part of why I got inspired by cooperatives, is this self-help approach to building this capacity. That said, I'll say the state does have a role in standing these things up, and I would love to see California do this. You could see a place in the state where they could model how the Rural Electrification Administration was done, where they essentially come in with state money, they provide low-interest loans, and stand up a co-op system, and then step back and let the co-op system run on its own. That would be an amazing role for the state, an amazing way for us to do public policy in California. We're not doing that. Instead, we view it as, can investor-owned firms do this, or can we keep funding it through the government, right? There's other funding models that are out there too. The state could also incentivize, but we don't necessarily need the state. Earlier, I heard someone talking about the role of philanthropy, and what are philanthropies going to do? Well, there's this amazing story of how the credit unions came about. No one ever asked, there's 5,000 credit unions in the United States. Where the hell did they come from? And it turns out it was philanthropy back in the 1920s. Edward Filene, a retail titan, put his own philanthropy out there to stand up these credit unions and had an industrial strategy. Today, the legacy of his philanthropy are these 5,000 credit unions who do amazing things in their community when they do amazing things. So what I would say is there's a role for the state to think differently in policy, but also there's these innovations in the past that we can pick up when the state is absent in these rules.
Great, thank you. Okay, last question from me, then we'll open it up to the room. But I think just a question, what is there an ask that you have for everyone here today to, when they go back to work tomorrow, taking away from your presentations, taking away from the day, what would you like people to see and do?
I guess my ask is change the narrative around water abundance in California, where, if somebody says we are a dry state, you could say, actually, we're not. But point the light on this 5% of California that doesn't have enough water. It's easy, if we think that the problem is everywhere, then there's kind of no solutions to it. But if we have this targeted, these are the households that are missing water, then it makes it a much more easier problem to solve.
What I would say is that in this moment where a lot of people are feeling a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, and wondering about what our future looks like, yes, get involved. By all means, don't give up on any of this, right? But don't think that the only place that you have to provide your energy and your power is through politics. There's other things you can do in your community. So I'm talking here about cooperatives, I'm talking about joint powers authorities, nonprofits, that sort of thing. Re-engage with those institutions and figure out how it is that you can serve on those boards. Figure it is how you can get them to interlink and work together through a tighter solidarity economy. We have all the change that we need in our local communities. We've just forgotten about it. I go back, was the book, I think from 1994, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. He's laying out the case that there's been civic decline in the United States since the 1940s, and I'd say it's worse now than ever. But the fortunate thing is that we're left with this amazing civic capacity that we've forgotten about, and it's just right there in our communities. So if you don't want to get involved in the political space, get involved in the civic economy, get involved in your local institutions, run for those boards, and re-engage with them. I'll add one more thing about that. One of my hobby horses I've just been so annoyed with is this conversation around California's housing insurance. And these housing insurance companies are pulling out of the markets. When State Farm and Nationwide announced they're pulling out of the market, it pisses me off so much to hear about. They are mutuals. They are owned by the policyholders. Imagine if you own a share of Apple stock and Tim Cook says, I'm going to take that from you. That's what these mutuals are doing to us right now. Our insurance commissioner at the state is not aware of what these mutuals are supposed to represent. They're owned by the homeowners. So it's to say we have this amazing capacity in this state to actually instigate change outside of just a political system, and it's time for us to re-engage with that.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's open it up. There's coffee over there if you need it.
Hi there. My question is mainly for Nicola, but also it's a bit of a broader question about abundance, and if any of the prior speakers want to give some color to it, I'd welcome that as well. So far, I've been hearing kind of one notion of abundance in that we need to kind of innovate more, like discover impediments or try to break down impediments to building publicly beneficial things like infrastructure and such. And such will make it, for example, less costly to, let's say, provide services to rural areas or places that are resource precarious. There's this other notion or definition of abundance that I sort of came in with, and it might have a little bit of friction, and I was wondering, like from the water perspective, if you have some opinion on this. In that, another way to look at it is that it's very costly for us for society to support sprawl as well. And so partially, is the answer in making it cheaper to support sprawl? Or is the answer for us to, let's say, this question's coming from the housing table, by the way. So we care a lot about infill and density, and we think if more people are brought maybe into areas that are much more readily served by important infrastructure such as water or cable internet, that actually that's a really good and simple means of creating or providing more abundance that actually doesn't require much innovation. But maybe you can speak to this from the water perspective. California is very sprawled, and isn't it very resource intensive to pump water to very far-flung regions? I'm not suggesting that they be deprived of water, but in terms of just the way that we plan and design society for the future, what abundance framing are you sort of adopting here?
Yeah. So I guess in terms of how I see that definition of abundance fitting in with this concept or with the water space is I do think that there are absolutely kind of economies of scale, if you will, where if you can have one canal bringing the water into a city and then a series of sort of distributed pipes, that's a lot easier than having, like the broadband story, a bunch of little tiny canals all connecting different places. That is reality, though, in a lot of rural areas, why we have all these individual groundwater wells. So each house, you drill a well, you have your own water supply, because it's so expensive to get water to you otherwise. There are some, simply having density, however, isn't always enough from a water perspective. And I'll point to Arizona as a cautionary tale there, where they have whole housing developments that overnight were cut off from the water utility because basically they built out where there wasn't enough water. And so, really thinking about if we are building this water, making sure that the water utilities, or building the housing, making sure that the water utilities know that that is going in and can plan for it. At the same time, our urban areas have been really, really good at continuing to grow our population while using less and less water per capita. So I do think that is a framework. I will say on urban development and density, there's also a lot to be done on the urban landform and sort of recreating the natural hydrology, where we want to try to be building not a whole bunch of concrete and asphalt hard surfaces, but trying to make sure that we can always have sort of connection of the land surface down into the aquifers. That helps with flood control, it helps with urban heat islands, it helps with water quality, all these different things. And so That's another piece of the abundance framework that I think that, depending on the urban design, could help with. Yeah.
Anything on energy?
What's that?
Anything on energy related?
So there is actually something related to that particular one. It mentioned the electric cooperative 9-Star. They have a water system outside of Indianapolis. And what they do, if you know anything about planning with rural regions, there's obviously not a planning department for rural jurisdictions. And they've been dealing with that where there's all these suburbs that are going up, or people want to have their big plots of land out in the middle of nowhere, then wanting all the utility services to come out. And what the co-op does is they engage with the members and say, hey, if you build out here, you're going to have to cover the cost out here. And how fair is that for you? It's not fair for you to be passing on those costs to the other ratepayers. So they make them aware of that. So if you get the folks that want to go out in the middle of nowhere and then like spread the cost around, they don't allow that with that electric cooperative. But what they do then to build additional trust is they say, we're not just some investor-owned utility that's out here to make money on you. We're here to make sure we're delivering a good quality of service. And this cost that you're trying to put on us goes out to all these other folks in the trailer park over there and this sort of thing. So they have it helps them almost operate like a de facto planning division for the county in a way. But it builds a lot more trust because they know, oh, the folks in that board, that's my neighbor. I can talk to them. I own that with them. And it's only the right thing to do.
Other questions?
Thanks, really interesting presentation. This one's for Nicola also. I'm wondering how the state can address dry domestic wells or even dry state smalls in rural areas when consolidation isn't an option. So we've seen state mandated consolidation in places like Toolville and Exeter, right? What do we do when we can't do that? Do we just dig deeper wells? Do we subsidize water delivery, which is happening in parts of Fresno County, right? Are there good options, or are these areas that maybe there's just no water for them right now and it's too expensive to provide that utility?
This is a really good question. Honestly, there aren't any terribly great options where, this is one where I'll bring up Sigma again, where I think the state could step in and say that the agricultural sector, the irrigation districts are drawing too much groundwater, and therefore, and that is why these wells have run dry. They wouldn't have drilled them to this depth if there wasn't water there initially. And so, it's longer term and it takes time for the aquifers to recover, but we can manage those aquifers much more actively in order to protect these. I think realistically, though, it is going to be having your tanker trucks driving in, and we can try to subsidize those, or thinking about moving people out of those spaces. And it's hard, again, tying to agriculture and when that is where your jobs are. But at the same time, we might want to be thinking about whether some of these agricultural areas are actually where we want to be growing things, or whether we want to be fallowing some of this and moving people into other spaces, denser building we were just hearing about, perhaps. There's also conversations around climate change, and are parts of the Central Valley going to become so hot that we don't want people living there? So, there's all these different interconnected sort of questions with that. In the meantime, the Band-Aid is the tanker trucks, but it's not the long-term solution. Yeah.
I think that's your last points too, getting into the politics of abundance, and that we're talking about an abundance frame, but that we need multiple abundance frames perhaps, but there are multiple potentially competing value systems at work, and how we work through those. And I know Amy's done a lot of work on this, of how do we build consensus across those different viewpoints, for example. So I'm wondering if either of you have things that you've seen in the real world of how have folks, I think, Keith, you gave some examples of people working with their neighbors and things, but are there any real world examples of navigating different value systems towards abundance?
Yeah, there's this fantastic book. It's very challenging, but it's so well written. It's by a professor at Georgetown called Against Democracy. And I love that book. It's so good. One of the things he talks about is, and he's very challenging, and he's spot on a lot of things. Talks about if we just relegate ourselves to the world of politics, then we're going to be dealing with a two-party system where each politician are dealing with 500 issue sets, and they don't neatly align, and it's really challenging for the everyday voter to understand the complexity of what they're representing. And I've talked with Brennan about the work that I'm doing, and what I see with the electric cooperatives is you kind of decouple one of the issue sets from these 500, and you put maybe 10 into the hands of the community with energy, for example. And it makes it where it's a lot easier for the community to figure out, address the challenges around that. So like that's one thing that I think is really a useful approach to help kind of take away some of the tension in our politics right now. Another thing is, I do think that the framing of all the things that's going on in our world and the people that are against me, that's just left or right, is another problem. I don't think everyone is exactly left or exactly right. I think that there's a lot of mix and match. I think there's also some folks that just are checked out and don't want to play in that area. We need to give people different arenas in order to have a community voice and participate. You know, you hear a lot of lip service around this concept of the third place, right? The place to go in your community. What does that look like? And can we go to those third places and not talk about MAGA, and not talk about progressives, and just talk about our community needs instead? I think that's what we need to work on a lot more. You think, like, it goes back to some of these conversations. Me being in my 40s, I went to school when we actually had a civics class. And I'm understanding K through 12 doesn't really have civics classes anymore. That blows my mind. That's horrible. Instead, students are getting economics, and they're kind of getting a government lesson, and that's about it. You know, what about operating a nonprofit? What about getting into cooperatives? What about starting businesses and reading a balance sheet and these sort of things? These are things that I think about that are these sound boring on the surface, but they're kind of revolutionary in a way, right? It allows you to get control of yourself, your neighborhood, your community, and kind of extract yourself from this scarcity mindset that we see in the political realm. That's what I want to see a lot more of.
So I guess kind of to build off of this, I am, a lot of my research focuses on collaborative governance. And so how you can structure decision-making when you have lots of different people coming from lots of different viewpoints, all trying to come to a kind of some sort of shared agreement about some government problem. And an example of really successful sort of coming to that type of agreement comes from a dam. I'm not going to name it, but up in the Sacramento Valley, broadly. The Sacramento watershed, I guess. And they were really, really careful about using sort of interest-based negotiation techniques. So for folks who aren't familiar with this is where instead of saying I have a position of, you said like MAGA versus progressives, MAGA good, progressives bad, or whatever that position is, if instead you can frame it in terms of your interests. I have an interest in having a high-quality job, or I have an interest in having a safe community. That then lets you start having an actual conversation about solutions that could be win-win. And in the example that I'll give on the dam that I was looking at, there's a fixed amount of water to go around. And in the room, you have people who want to use the water to generate electricity. You have people who want to use the water for irrigation. You have people who want to have a lot of water in the river for whitewater kayaking. You have people who want to have fish. You have people who want to have floodwaters for riparian health, like all these different pieces. And as soon as they could start saying like, hey, this is, my interest is in having, for my interest of riparian health, I need there to be a little bit of floodwater in these months in the spring. Or for the whitewater rafters, like really, I just care about Saturdays and this much flow. And they could start then coming to building out this kind of whole system of management for the dam that let everybody get what they were looking for. Whereas if it had come in and just said, well, it's irrigation versus everybody else, there'd be like one winner and a bunch of losers. But instead they came up to something that pretty much everyone got kind of what they were looking for.
That's great. I think that ties before to the discussion around outcomes. Thinking about outcomes as opposed to processes, and it's not irrigation for irrigation's sake, or it's not conservation for conservation's sake, but towards a particular outcome. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This has been super interesting. I've really enjoyed it. And it occurs to me that we're coming up against a lot of like tragedy of the commons issues with some of these things. And particularly, you know, we're talking about groundwater recharge, and then we heard from Anastasia about the milk and the almond production. And I know that that's coming from kind of a scarcity mindset, but it does occur to me that we're dealing with a lot of like land use issues, or even with energy. I know that there's a lot of like solar agriculture, land competition. And so I know we kind of already touched on this, but I guess I'm curious about like how do you maintain or how do you promote local autonomy while still acknowledging like the benefits of a more regional or state level strategy, even with energy and like transmission, you know, or you, like, yeah, anyways, that's my question. Thanks.
So the main question being, how do you balance local autonomy and state level or regional level strategizing? Here, I think this is another one where collaboration can be really beneficial, where you can have, in this case, sort of coordination across all of the local regions, local decision makers, but with the state stepping in as kind of, here is the broader vision that we are working toward. And so if we can say, well, we have a vision of wanting this type of sustainability, or we want a vision of having water affordability or human right to water or something like that, that says, okay, here's how we can coordinate all of our efforts, kind of align our arrows maybe towards that goal. But then you still have a lot of autonomy at the local scale for how you actually go about doing that. And so I think it takes a lot of dialogue and a lot of coordination, and it takes a lot from the state checking in with the local level, not just, oh, I wrote a plan and now it's going to go sit on a shelf, but actually, okay, what are we doing? How are we, let's check in, what are we implementing? Where are we relative to the targets that we've set? And so sort of that ongoing dialogue. Yeah.
And I would add that, so if you talk to the everyday economist, they'll tell you that a PG&E is going to operate far more efficiently than one of these tiny electric cooperatives. But I can tell you that my experience in the field says otherwise. South Dakota has an electric cooperative that I think has 900 meters, which is a very, very tiny electric cooperative. But what they're able to do in order to drive down their cost is they pool together into wholesale purchasing cooperatives called generation transmission cooperatives. And they scale, you know, dozens, if not, in one case, there's over 100 electric cooperatives that join together. So they're able to pool their purchasing power, own the generating assets, these sort of things. But then they economize in other ways. So they'll go out and they'll say, we need to have really great marketing. So they'll form what's called touchstone marketing. 500 electric cooperatives are members of that. Now we need to have capital. How do we get capital that's really efficient? Well, they form with the farm credit system. CoBank is a member of the farm credit system. It's a $160 billion bank and allows them to get really cheap capital for their electric cooperatives. But when CoBank's not able to provide lending, the electric cooperatives went out and formed another bank called National Rural Utilities Cooperative Finance Corporation, NRUCFC for short. And what they do is they bundle the debt offering of all these little electric cooperatives and go to Wall Street and make Wall Street operate on behalf of Main Street, buy their bonds. So they do all these really cool things that allow them to have power in the global economy. And this is what I think of this concept as scaling local. It allows them to say, we're going to have our local autonomy, we're going to be able to maintain power where we want, but then figure out where we're going to get advantage by working together and form these federations along the way. So there's all these cool strategies that are out there that we miss because we overlook these rural institutions. We think they're these primitive, you know, folks that are out there doing nothing, but they're doing really amazing things that could teach us a lot for civil society and building up these local institutions.
Thank you.
So I apologize in advance. This is not my area of expertise, so this may be a very simple question. But why can't we use that model with the water? Like, why can't people build their own wells, or, you know, the farmers come together and figure out if there's a plot of land or area where they can kind of get their own reserves, and not be as reliant on this community resource?
So, I mean, originally that is why the irrigation districts were formed, was because you had all these individual farmers and actually before that, individual miners who realized that they couldn't individually get the infrastructure to pull the water out of the river and build the canals and get it to their plot of land, wherever that was. But if you got 20 farmers together to do that, then they could pool resources and they could build that infrastructure and move it around. The challenge realistically in California is that mismatch of where the water is and where people live. There are parts of the state where, yeah, you could have your local utility build all of its infrastructure and manage it. Greater Los Angeles, if we didn't have the State Water Project pulling water from the Feather River way up north in Northern California, like we wouldn't have enough water to supply that entire metropolitan area. The Central Valley, there is not enough water to supply all of the agriculture there without the federally supported Central Valley Project. Like all of those things, it's because of that mismatch. And so you have some cities like San Francisco has enough capacity that they were able to build their own dams and build their own canals, but a lot of them are going to be too small. So either we have to rethink where people live, or drastically cut back how much water we use, which is probably not going to happen. Yeah. I will say though, there are still some opportunities for, and Keith and I were talking about this. I think some of the water utilities are really good about like coordinating with each other and learning sort of this broader polycentric governance type approach. In some regions of California, in other regions of California, they are very, very isolated and just do their own thing and want to compete with each other over water. And so I think there is still something we could do, even if it's not over the infrastructure, but at least over like learning and resources and capacity building. Yeah.
One thing I'd add there too is if you want to think about our economy as kind of like agriculture, there's all these institutions and they interact with each other and they change their logics. So like monocropping or hybrids and this sort of thing. Think about your high school and college education. What are the classes you had? You were trained in your economics class how to trade shares in the stock market. You weren't necessarily trained to run a small business. You were definitely not trained in cooperatives. There used to be a lot more classes in the United States around cooperatives. Wisconsin used to be a hotbed of that. Across Europe, they're actually trying to make it where they're putting cooperatives and the social economy into the economics programs. What that means is that the folks that are coming into spaces that you're dealing with, they might have like a master's in finance or something like that. And so they might be running municipalities, they might be running co-ops, but they're thinking in terms of running it almost like an investor-owned firm. They have to have different business logics in order to make it really run optimally when they can run optimally, when it's not resource constrained. So what I see with the cooperatives, what they're able to do is they're able to shield themselves from this monocropping from the investor-owned sector because they have their own trainings. And they're brought in, they're onboarding into the cooperative family, as they call it. But you don't see that in other areas like credit unions. You don't see that in food cooperatives so much even. It's kind of crazy. Purchasing cooperatives would be another area that you miss out on there too. So we need to have more education, more institutional literacy around all of these things in order to have people really innovate and make them better.
Great. We have 1 minute, so I will wrap. This has been great, and I'm amazed that we got to our 4:45 point. I thought, oh, we're going to struggle here, but we got there. This is a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed this. It's been a pleasure to ask questions. I think the thing that I'm left with is, and we heard a little bit about this before, about the paralysis that comes from our fixation with global and even national political and environmental issues. And as we've heard here, there are a bunch of, in Keith's words, cool strategies, things that we can do, things that are happening right now, and that these problems are not too big to solve. And I would think that another takeaway from Keith is that we have the civic capacity. We're just not using it. So let's get out there and use it and do all these things that you said. Thanks, everyone.